Well, welcome back, everybody. It's great to see you all, especially those who've been with this series since the very beginning. And tonight we change tack a little and get ready to tackle a different set of questions in relation to the book of Revelation. Wow, we've been away on something of an aside in our study journey for several weeks now, as we've sought to learn a little about the Illuminatus and the threat they are presenting to mankind, a very real and present threat. Indeed, when they first started in Bavaria, the government was lucky to find out about them, and this only happened because a courier carrying conspiratorial documents was struck down dead on the road and his documents discovered. The word was passed on to the government, and then across Europe, and Austria outlawed the society and expelled its members from all offices. But that is about the last time anyone ever purged them from offices of state as far as the public record goes. Before studying the Illuminatus, we took some time to get a feel for Islam, to see where it stands in relation to Christendom, terrorism aside. The evidence is reasonably strong that it will be a Muslim army and Muslim forces that occupy Israel in the not too distant future to defile its newly constituted temple and to mount a persecution against Jews and Christians that will have its counterpart in the work of the Illuminati, who will by then be forbidding public assemblies or evangelism by any religion in Western countries and imprisoning those who do not relent. Today we return to the simple Bible and to perhaps the most referenced passage there is in relation to prophecy in the Gospels, Matthew 24. We'll be looking particularly at just how similar the account given in Matthew 24 is to the series of events depicted in the central chapters of the book of Revelation. Although there are continuing assertions that everything recorded in Matthew 24 was already fulfilled during the period from 68 through 70 AD, with the campaign of Titus against Jerusalem and against the temple, I'm going to follow the line that Jesus was instead speaking about the very end of this current age, when Jerusalem will fall again, and an even worse persecution is to be launched. The disciples were no doubt still thinking in terms of Jesus, temple, and Israel when they were asking their questions, while Jesus will have known that it was not just about Israel, but about the whole world. So therefore we start with Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation and the correspondence between those two. The central chapters in the book of Revelation, by which I mean chapters 11 to 14, are summarized in an account given by Jesus in Matthew 24, and there's a parallel account also in Luke 21. The Matthew text indeed turns out to be highly structured and allows us to make a rather direct correlation between the verbal discourse of Jesus and the pictorial discourse of John's Revelation. Chapter 11, we're talking about chapters 11 to 14. Well, chapter 11 is about the two witnesses. Chapter 12 is about the woman clothed in the sun who gives birth to the male child who will rule the nations, and also the dragon being cast down from heaven to earth. And the church is empowering also. Now, chapter 13 has the two beasts and the mark of the beast. And chapter 14 has the great test and the resurrection of the just and the unjust, the test being not to receive the mark. And of course the introduction of the idea of 666 and anyone who receives that mark receiving the plagues and falling into the second resurrection, the resurrection of the unjust instead of the resurrection of the just. Now, the scene in Matthew 24 begins with the disciples admiring the beautifully restored temple. Now, Herod sort of tried to, I think, win the favor of the Jews by hugely beautifying the temple that was already there before. Now, the temple was already quite spectacular, but Herod really went to town on it. I think he had a building plan of some 40 or so years on the temple. And as the disciples admire the beautifully restored temple, we have to realize that in a prophetic sense, the health of the temple is intricately linked to the pleasure of God with the nation. Now, the beautified temple was suggesting that maybe God's blessings were still upon the nation, but Jesus is saddened by his last few days at the temple, in which he has also had strong confrontations with the temple managers who are unable to receive his message. Jesus knows this only bodes for one thing in the future, and he solemnly prophesies to his disciples that before long not a single stone of the temple will remain standing one on another. All will be ruined. Christ's own body and the temple are almost one, and the health and fate of either bodes for the health of the nation. So Jesus came out of the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly, I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." Jesus knew that it was his own body that was going to be torn down, and so too with the temple edifice. The disciples are amazed and must have found these words hard to accept. Later they asked Jesus to explain more about the end of the age. Somehow the disciples knew already that Jesus was going away somewhere soon. They didn't know whether it was a physical place or a heavenly place. And they knew that they didn't know that it might be some time before his return. I guess they hoped it wasn't going to be too long. They understood at least that his return was linked to the end of the age, which they also thought must be close or near at hand. And that was sort of justifiably, that was understandable, because they maybe understood Daniel's prophecy of Daniel 2, where the stone would come and break the statue at its feet. They possibly thought that they were in the iron part of the statue, the legs, so they thought it wouldn't be long till they would be in the feet. So they pressed Jesus for more details of exactly what was going to happen. So, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So they have two questions, and they are, when shall these things be? That is the destruction of Jerusalem described in Matthew 24, 1-2, in Jesus' own words. And secondly, what's going to be the sign of the end of the age and of your coming? Now, in typically Hebrew fashion, Jesus answers their questions in reverse order, which is in accordance with the chiastic pattern of A, B, B, A. The disciples understand so far that the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem will precipitate the end of the age. Yet historically, Jerusalem was to fall several times before the end of the age. So for the record, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, in their telling of the history of Jerusalem, in the whole history of Jerusalem, the city has actually been occupied 43 times and has been destroyed 17 times. So Jesus speaks only of that fall of Jerusalem that immediately precedes his second coming. He warns from the outset that those last times will be full of incredible deception. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Matthew 24, 4-5, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many." Now he begins his answer to the second question by describing a time of general social disorder, where there are famines and earthquakes, and yet even then the end is not yet. Matthew 26, 6b. Indeed, it is just the beginning of the throes, that is, of childbirth. Matthew 24, 8. Matthew 24, 6-8 says, "And you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end." Now, to read those verses in their entirety, it says, "You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs." Now, I believe that we are living in those days right now, and in the background here I have a picture of the four riders of the apocalypse, the first 4 seals, but the colours are of course washed out. But this is to indicate that these wars between nations are just the beginnings of the woes. We do know that from the first four riders we have the white horse riders interpreted to be the appearance of false Christs and false religious leaders, false messianic doctrines, even the messianic doctrines of false religions. The second horse rider is actually a red one, which is the rider of war. This is where Jesus is talking about war between nations. The third one is famine and drought, the black horse rider, and the fourth one is death that follows from all of the other three, from false religious campaign, from war, and from drought and famine. So the words of Jesus here about nation against nation and famines and earthquakes are basically these first 4 Revelation 6 horse riders. Now, as I said, I believe we're living in those days right now. These pretty much correspond to the breaking of the first 4 seals out of the 7 in Revelation 4. And these events are not tied to any 7-year or 3.5-year scheme like the temple desecration or mark of the beast. And they can run for some time before the final Antichrist appears and sets the Daniel 9 clock back into motion. Now, earthquakes and famines are connected to cosmic imbalance and divine warnings. A spike in the number of devastating earthquakes has already been seen on the Earth since around 2001. And in 2017 there were 69 active volcanoes in the Ring of Fire alone. I think there's a couple more since then, when the long-run average is closer to just 5. New volcanoes are also rising from the sea bottom in 3 places around the world. Tectonic jitters seem to indicate something like a cosmic body moving invisibly through our solar system, or perhaps some sort of magnetic anomaly from the Sun or the Sun-Earth system. Now, if Jesus knew a planet was coming, he would know from the oral traditions that famines and earthquakes would also come. So it could be interpreted either way. This period of wars and rumours of more wars, basically, addition is mine when I put the word more in there, describes the period since around the turn of the century, which will probably run for a good 20 to 30 years before it results in attempts to fully implement the New World Order. These wars are about access to the last of Earth's cheap energy, and about the United States getting a cut on every oil sale in the world by insisting on oil trading only through the petrodollar. That means all purchases have to be done in US dollars, which produces foreign currency exchange commissions for the US, and to a way to eventually extinguish Arab influence in the world. And we see already that the Arab oil supplies are drying up, and the Trump government has considerable leverage over the Arab countries at the moment. Now, the United States has for some time now made out that it's fighting terrorism or enemies, but it's nonsense to spend $110 trillion, for instance, to seek out and destroy 70 al-Qaeda leaders in foreign lands. They could just pay foreign spies to do that. The transition to alternative energy is being held back as more and more fossil fuel is consumed. It was Nostradamus who spoke of a 27-year war that would end with the appearance of the third Antichrist. Now, if we're to merge this time frame with the times indicated by Revelation 12's sign of the moon rising under the heavenly woman's feet, it seems that late 2026 could be when this figure finally emerges. We say that because Nostradamus talked about some sort of a battle in August of 1999, and another reference to a 27-year campaign. So if that 27-year campaign runs from 1999, it would bring us to 2026. Anyway, every year it seems somebody is sure the big one, that is a nuclear war, is about to break out. Lately, the notion of time travel, purportedly discovered as a byproduct of the new UFO technologies, seems to be doing the rounds, and a series of persons have appeared on YouTube channels claiming to have lived for several years at a time in the future, and they're so-called coming back to report what they've seen there. They're always asked about whether climate change has destroyed the world or whether World War III has been fought. Now, among those coming back from the future, allegedly, is John Titor, who has warned from the history he learned in 2030 that a nuclear war broke out in January 2018. Well, at the time I'm recording this, that probably would have happened under a Hillary government, but under a Trump government that has not happened. This particular scenario involves Iran, helped by Russia, getting a preemptive strike on the United States, Israel, Britain, and France by flying in missile-laden planes in the radar shadows of regular passenger liners. Now, the missing MH370, if it went to Iran, as evidence might suggest, could be converted into such a plane, from which nuclear weapons could be dispatched over the United States and detonated before any real response could be made. Systems watching Iran for a launch would be wasting their time. Luckily, January 2018 has passed, but the sinister idea with the planes is always there, and we can thank Titor for that warning at least. Now, it's not to say that these things couldn't arise after the Trump government's finished, when we might revert, for instance, to a democratic government, but let's not count our chickens at this stage. Now, back to the text of Matthew 24. This period of wars and famines and earthquakes now continues until Israel is invaded and the new temple is desecrated. It's within this period of upheaval that it seems the temple will be rebuilt, with the temple sacrifices reinitiated. This is the period of wars and famines, etc., which we're already in. And the temple sacrifices will also be reinitiated. We're moving into that period now, and things will then return to the state they were in during the days of Jesus. And so we could say the two halves of the 70th week of Daniel could now be reconnected. This period of wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, and famines all precedes the appearance of the Antichrist and the beginning of the Great Tribulation. And the next section in Matthew 24, 9 through 26 will now contain 18 verses in translation. These 18 verses are interestingly delivered in 3 sets of 6 verses, as if alluding to the apocalyptic 666. Now, rather than a single specific sign for the disciples to pass on, Jesus gives them 3 categories of signs to watch for. Now, the first category is in Matthew 24, verses 9 to 14. This is the category which could best be summarized as suppression of the church and the great falling away, which in Greek is the apostasia, or if you like, the apostasy. Those verses say, "Then they'll deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. The end shall come." Although one could perhaps speak at length on the topic of falling away and false prophets, we will limit our comments. Firstly, we will assume that the ones who betray others are the same as those who have fallen away. Ordinarily, when a saint falls away, he goes back into sin. He loses his spiritual discernment, but he does not usually betray anyone in the church, except it is from lack of understanding, or he is deceived into doing so. In any case, what is there to betray? The answer seems to be 2 things. Number 1 would be his companion's unwillingness to comply with orders to attend at some sort of government-approved or licensed church, such as one typically encounters in communist countries. Even the ministers of such churches will hardly be Christian, and possibly not even new conversions will be allowed. So controllers might use the churches simply as instruments of the state. Number 2, what is there to betray would be location. Evangelical churches may have been outlawed, and so their meetings might by then be going on in remote and secret places. Jesus' warnings to avoid going to see him in the secret place may be because such ploys will be a way for the establishment to flush out where Christians are meeting in secret. A false Christian, a government agent, may hear a claim that Jesus has appeared to someone in a Christian fellowship, in a secret fellowship with some Christians, and the excited saint may lead what he assumes is his fellow saint to his secret place of worship. Not only will those who have fallen away betray one another, but they will even hate one another, and this hatred appears to have come about from being betrayed. It will be like the sin of Judas. As part of purifying his church before Christ's return, God will probably cause a huge split to occur within the Catholic Church as the sins of its leaders are exposed. And I think this is about to happen right now as I write in June of 2018. And its history will be re-examined. Many Catholics will lose their faith or will change over and join one of the Protestant denominations. But if, in the meantime, the Catholic Church has secured for itself rights as the leader of a world ecumenical church, with the power to enforce all churches to join this union or to be declared anathema, there is immediately a serious situation in which many Christians could be betrayed to the state as religious rebels. The love that grows cold is probably men's love for God, given that Jesus puts this down to increasing lawlessness, which is sinfulness. It is sinners who reject the love of God and even the love of their fellow man just to hold on to the freedom to sin. This is what Paul is talking about. This is what lawlessness is. It's a refusal to come under the laws of God. Not laws of the land, but basically laws of God first. Perhaps also laws of the land. Now, to do this, people have to have a lack of love for God and for their fellow man. And so sinners will be rejecting the love of God and even the love of their fellow man just for that right to sin freely, to be unanswered, without having to answer to anybody. And in fact, the people like the British Crown and the Vatican have this attitude all the time. Yet, in such loveless societies, the love of Christ only stands out more brightly for its selfless and indomitable nature. Now, these 6 verses in Matthew almost certainly describe the period of the Great Tribulation, and this betrayal is very much a part of this period's tribulation and bitterness. Jesus mentions that right from the outset, many will be killed. Now, to avoid betraying or being betrayed, many will become enclosed and secretive, which works to the devil's favor, of course, in a time when the church is being urged to go out one more time to share its gospel everywhere. To add insult to injury, a great spirit of deception will also be at work in the world, and deceiving spirits will find their way into some parts of the church. But for those who have the discernment of the Holy Spirit in them, they will survive this deception, whereas many others who are there only for perhaps the entertainment or whatever else it is the church provides them, will fall away and be taken by the deception. And as they fall away, the church will, in fact, be purified. Now, in this time of deception, perhaps because of these sort of initiatives of the Trump government at the moment, many of the church leaders and teachers will in fact be arrested, and they'll actually turn into government stooges. They'll be replaced by government stooges. This is where the danger lies. And these stooges will rise up as misleading prophets of the end times, prophesying a pacifying message of good and peace, when there is in fact an urgency to risk one's life for the gospel, because the time will be so short. So false prophets are implicitly understood to be church leaders. And such leaders, especially if charismatic and controlling, and also promising light in a dark place, will not only gain their sustenance from the church, but will also gain it from their state and from Jesuit sponsors. And they'll end up betraying their flocks when it becomes a choice between them and the flock. And this, of course, is one of the signs Jesus gives, that the false prophet is the one who does not protect his flock. That is, they are false shepherds and wolves in sheep's clothing. False signs may well be seen and admired in their ministries, as befits the ministers of Satan. And in fact, Paul talks about Satan doing all kinds of works by the power of, the Antichrist doing all kinds of works by the power of Satan himself. So it's not to say that the devil can't have power to work miracles, and this is where the great deception lies. If people just follow miracles, they can easily be deceived. If the New World Order is not already in place by then, the greatest deception of all will take place in the second half of the Antichrist rule, and there will be terrifying but staged alien attacks where demons in alien bodies, flying in UFOs, will decimate cities and abduct many, either as hostages or food. The state will now make some sort of disclosure that the DNA of the aliens and of the human hostages is so similar that aliens and humans might even be descended from a common ancestor. And this attack on the Genesis account will be the final phase of the great philosophical lie. Now, the state, to stop forces rallying against this lie, may preemptively hijack the alternative media as well, and take steps to close the dark web. With all lifelines closed off to the saints, the world's shadow government will push for the outlawing of all religion of any sort, and swear in the leaders of the New World Order. They might do so under a state of emergency. Now, Jesus now homes in on the people of Israel and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem as the time of trouble is about to break out. Now, he's talking about a disclosure that the DNA of the aliens and the human hostages are so similar that it seems they must be descended from a common ancestor. And with this, the lie will be complete. Now, it's not when the armies enter Jerusalem, but when the Antichrist is revealed in the temple that the people should basically run for their lives and not look back. As the only fate that awaits them after the Antichrist appears in Jerusalem is their certain death. Now, the lie that's propagated will sort of claim that mankind as we know it, the biblical account of the creation of man, is really the account of some alien super race producing man in the alien genetics laboratory. But those who stay behind and decide to, believe this, among the Jews anyway, will face certain death because there is a spirit of hatred behind this invader, which is certainly a spirit that wants to destroy the Jews and even the Christians. Now, whatever it is that's put in the Temple of Jerusalem, it's sort of the equivalent of the ancient statue of Moloch or Baal. In fact, if that image should be raised there and appearing in the temple, it's certainly an indicator that the Jews are about to be slaughtered. Now, face value, reading the text and the numbers that we see in Daniel, the 1260 days and the 1290 days, it seems that the delay between the invasion of Israel and the temple sacrilege might be 30 days, because it's talking about 1290 days of being trodden, of desecration, but then 1260 days in which the saints have to survive the ministry of the Antichrist. So there's a 30-day difference there. So the temple's desecration is 1290 days, but the Great Tribulation is 1260 days. So the Great Tribulation, the Great Persecution, seems to follow 30 days after the temple is defiled by the Antichrist and whatever he puts in the temple. Now, it could be that those 30 days are some sort of days of toleration before the Great Tribulation begins in earnest. They might be days in which the Protestant churches, for instance, are being entreated to combine with the Catholic Church. Or these could just be the days required to initiate martial law and activate death camps, get them ready for what's about to come. 1290 days is in fact closer to the 3.5 solar years than the sacred 1260 days are. After all, the 1260 days are 3.5 years on a 360-day calendar. Now, the resurrection and final judgment both need to stand between the end of the 1260 days and the cleansing of the temple that Daniel speaks of at the end of 1335 days. So there seems to be another 45 days at the end of it all, which seem to correspond to the period separating the raising of the saints in resurrection and the end of the final judgment, when the world will be purged of all of its sinners. So there's perhaps an indication here that the period of judgment on the world will take about 45 days. And in fact, in the time of Noah, the great downpour of water that flooded the earth and killed the sinners also took about 40 days. Now, what was category 2 of Jesus' message? Turning now to Matthew 24, verses 15 to 20. This is the next set of 6 verses. And it's talking here about the fall of Jerusalem and the abomination of desolation. Here are the verses. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, side note, let the reader understand. In other words, it's something we should study and to get a good grasp of. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house even. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, obviously because they can't travel quickly. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Now, about the closest that the Romans in 68 AD came to placing an abomination in the temple was to place their standard there before starting their siege against the city. And that's not quite the same as the abomination of desolation, I don't think, although it's certainly in the same spirit. It's laying their claim to the temple and denying the Jews access to it. Now, signs did appear in the temple in the days before Roman judgment finally fell, according to the historian Josephus. And these signs included the temple door, which normally took 22 men to push open, opening by itself. And there was also a star that looked like a spear or an arrow appearing in the sky, and it seemed to be pointing to the southeast, as if to say to the people, escape in that direction. Now, when a crowd from Jerusalem instead took these signs as an encouragement to attack the Roman army that had originally come just to shut down the temple and throw the people out of Jerusalem, it was soon replaced by an even stronger response under Titus, which allowed no one at all to even survive, and which saw the temple razed to the ground. But this was not yet the overthrow that Jesus spoke of, for the abomination of desolation had not yet been seen. So Jesus was obviously speaking of another overthrow in the future. Many Christians, however, did think this was the fulfillment of Jesus' words, and so they fled to the southern wilderness, following Jesus' words, during a lull in the Roman occupancy, and this was just before Titus returned, and therefore they escaped the Jerusalem massacre that the Jews did experience because they were not believing, of course, in the words of Jesus. So the words of Jesus did actually serve a useful function for saving many of the Jerusalem Christians. Now, what was category 3 of the words of Jesus? What's the third set of 6 verses in his account, verses 21 through 26? And here Jesus is talking about the Great Tribulation and lying prophets. And these are the verses. For then there shall be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world, even now, nor ever will be again. And I think he's sort of quoting from Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2 here. Now, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Remember, Paul talked about the man of sin coming with all manner of signs and wonders, but at the power of Satan. So as to lead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I've told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or, behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. The Bible, if anything, has a habit of understating the case a little. But in this passage, Jesus is quite blunt. Many periods of suffering have been bad, but this really will be the most vicious of them all. Nothing can match it, or in his own words, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world. The difference in this case is that the persecution corresponds to a time when for the first time since the world began, that is, since human civilization began, Satan will be operating at full power against the saints. The gloves will be off. His time will be short, in fact, very short, and he knows that he's only a few years away from the final judgment. Jesus is also clear about the price to pay, which in most cases, sooner or later, will be death. Only the fact that there are still some saints to spread the gospel keeps the clock ticking. I have a picture of the two witnesses laying in the street of the great city. We understand from Revelation 11 that the world will be actively trying to kill them during the time of their final ministry. So, by the time Jesus comes back, there will be virtually no saints still alive. And we can summarize this in three ways. This is when the two witnesses lay, as if completely dead, in the street of the great city, and the people of the earth will send presents to one another to celebrate the end of their time and of Jewish religion on earth. Jesus asks, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith in the world? And here, except those days should be shortened, there would be no saint's life left. So it seems that only some will make it to the end. Nevertheless, Paul encourages saints at Thessalonica that those who remain alive will join the others in the air as Christ resurrects the dead. Those who remain alive may by then be scattered pockets of Christians. Of course, these Christians will be converting other Christians at the same time, so it's not like the curve is completely dropping to zero, but certainly there'll be a great attrition. Those who remain alive will be scattered pockets of Christians. It's not going to be easy, but who can tell? God could, after all, cause Christianity to explode under these circumstances, even under these harshest of conditions, because that's just exactly what happened in Roman times when Christians were being executed and sent to the lions. Christianity was so admired for the way it suffered that people in the end flocked to it, especially as they became disillusioned with the Roman Empire. And perhaps as people become disillusioned with the New World Order and all the evil that's being done to it to set it in place. As stated earlier, this trick of flushing out Christians with the call of here he is and there he is will still be operating right to the end. And Christians should not even check out whether such claims are true. Jesus warns the saints, do not believe such tricks. Secret places such as the wilderness and inside large complexes of buildings, the inner places, are in fact typical places of slaughter and body disposal. Now Jesus has now answered the question, what will be the sign of your coming, quite thoroughly. And then in Matthew 24 verses 27 to 31 he goes back to the question, the very first question, when shall these things be? This section is subdivided into three parts again, and these verses cover the same time period as is otherwise described in accounts of the Great Resurrection in Revelation 14 to 20, and the sixth seal in Revelation 6, verses 12 to 17. These will speak of the same period of time. Revelation 14 to 16, for instance, speaks of the resurrection of the righteous. It says there, then I looked, and behold, a white cloud. And sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe, which means the sins of men have become complete. And also the perfection of the church has arrived. And then he who sat on the cloud swung a sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now the second part of the resurrection period is the reaping of the wicked. And this follows directly after the reaping of the righteous. Revelation 14:18b through 20, the resurrection of the wicked. And we read from that text, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. Now the ripeness before was of the saint, but now it's the ripeness of the sinner. And so the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth, and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horses' bridles, and flowed out to 1,600 stadia. Revelation 6 verses 12 to 17, which is an alternative way of describing this period of time. This is the sixth seal, which actually corresponds also to the second coming, which is when the world is destroyed and the dead are raised, which we've just been reading about. So Revelation 6:12 to 17 reads as follows. And I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. And the sky was split apart like a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Now, I'd just like to bring your attention to one curious phase in the Greek before we move on, which translators have probably fumbled. The Greek has the whole moon turned to blood, but I think the redundancy of the word whole is supposed to point us to the translation the full moon turned to blood. So if we can accept these events to have taken place at Passover, because that's the only actual festival in Israel which takes place at the full moon instead of at the new moon. So the second coming, therefore, takes place when there's a full moon, which must mean it's at a Passover. Now, it's my opinion that if this is going to be like his death in April 28 AD, this is going to be another April Passover. And that would be, in some ways, to reconnect two parts of the 70th week. Indeed, could we be taken right back to that moment on the cross when the sun was darkened and Jesus was close to death? Because these things happened when Jesus hung there dying. His mockers called to him at that time to come down from his cross and save himself. But what if that is exactly what he does when he returns? Could this be the sign of the Son of Man that he speaks about? Is it not the same sign that he spoke of to his disciples? He explained to them that just as Moses raised up the snake in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that all who see him can live. John 3 verses 13 to 14. Surely the cross and Christ upon it is the sign of the Son of Man. That's the thing that sets apart Jesus in the world's mind, him crucified on a cross. The fact that not only do the sun and moon get darkened and eclipsed, but that the stars also fall from heaven to earth, indicates that something truly colossal is actually happening. Certainly with the stars falling, there seems to be the suggestion of a movement of the Earth's axis. With the sun and moon also being darkened, it seems that there is a great cosmic collision of some sort going on. And this will be the subject of later studies in the series. But we can say that this tells us something at least about when Christ will return. The when is when a massive geographical displacement of the Earth's axis occurs. And such an event can only occur if something on the scale of a planetary body is in the Earth's vicinity and moving past, or perhaps moving right at us. The effects will be far worse than just a rolling of the axis. They will include a complete meltdown of the Earth's crust. We will dwell upon this more as we come to later studies, as I've said, and especially the last study of all in the series, when we try to figure out what is it that causes the great plagues of Armageddon. But enough said that no bunker or mountain-top retreat or undersea base or submarine is going to be able to save the sinner, no matter how much money he has invested in his physical salvation. And this includes those who have actually set up their insurance policies by having places to live on the moon or Mars or some other place in the solar system. And so God obviously is going to have to shake up the whole solar system in the great day of judgment. It says in Revelation 6 verses 12 to 17, the sixth seal, that Then the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the commanders, and the rich, and the strong, and every slave and free man, this means everybody basically, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now, all their bases and their caves and their bunkers will actually melt and be shattered in the heat and in the earthquakes. And if they're deep underground, they're only going to be buried deep underground. They'll never come out of their bases at all. Their bases and caves and bunkers will melt and be shattered. Those who have escaped the earth will be rounded up in other ways, as we'll relate later. There really will be no escape. This is not just a scenario for how Israel will be saved or punished, but a scenario for the whole world. The secrecy of the world's rulers and of the satanic conspiracies will now be ended. Christ will publicly expose them and their dark works. We know this is already beginning to happen under the Trump government, but it's going to go on until God has completely uncovered it all. And if Trump doesn't do it, then Christ will do the exposing, the rest of the exposing. There's going to be nothing concealed about what the devil has been doing, but also nothing concealed about the second advent. It will be completely a public and visible event, which is why Jesus said not to run off to the secret places. From Revelation 1:7 it says, Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all peoples on earth will mourn because of him, yet so shall it be. Amen. And in Matthew 24:30 it says, At that time the sign of the Son of Man shall appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Now, the fact they mourn could be for themselves, but it could also be at seeing the suffering of Jesus on the cross again, realizing what it was that happened to Jesus all those years ago for their sins, and they haven't taken advantage of the blood that was shed for their behalf. They'll realize that they've missed their great chance. They've sold their souls for something that really wasn't worth it. Now, let's break down that part into the three parts we mentioned. So the first part is Matthew 24:27 to 28. It says, For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, which of course is very sudden, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And the second part will be Matthew 24:29, where it says, But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. And again, this is cross-reference to Revelation 6 and the sixth seal. And the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And this is linked, I guess, to the falling of the stars. And the third section in Matthew 24 says, and this is in verses 30 to 31, And then shall the sign of the Son of Man, whether it's a cross or a lamb or the covenant ark or Daniel 7's fiery throne, one of those signs will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And this great trumpet is generally understood to be the seventh apocalyptic trumpet, although some will argue it's different, but I think they're the same. Now, Jesus now gives a few signs as to when all these things might actually begin to happen. And the first sign he gives is actually a more general one. It's the sign of the fig tree blossoming. We find this right back. We find this in Matthew 24:32-35. He's sort of going back over the story again and trying to fill in the gaps. Now, it's understood that the fig tree stands for the nation of Israel. And we can see that the nation of Israel has now been planted and is growing again in its native soil, that is, in its own land. And so the blossoming of the fig tree, in a way, is the blossoming of the nation of Israel. Jesus summarizes everything with a more general sign. The parable of the fig tree, Matthew 24:32-35, And so we seem to think that this blossoming of the tree is the rebirth of the state of Israel in 1948. Jesus speaks of this replanted people, and he says of them that this generation will not pass away until the Son of Man comes. Now, we have to sort of decide what he means by this generation. It could mean this people, this reborn Jewish nation itself. Or he might mean he might be indicating a sort of duration of time when he says that, in which case he might be speaking of that some of the people who return to Palestine will not pass away before Christ returns. And since some of those people could be very, very young, it would place a limit of no more than a century from 1948 and probably less, because very few people will reach 100 years of age. So if we said 70 years, we'd be thinking in terms of, say, 2018, which is right now, or thereabouts, for when these things will begin to happen. Now, the summer of which he speaks is, of course, a time of heat. And it points also to the fiery tribulation that comes soon after the fall of Jerusalem, which will be a time of sort of spiritual heat for those who are being persecuted by the Antichrist who comes. So when the tribulation breaks out, it is the beginning of the end. The fall of Jerusalem therefore marks the point at which the last half of Daniel's 70th week resumes. So the great sign is actually the fall of Jerusalem, and it's confirmed by the placing of some sort of image or some sort of desecration of the temple by that man of sin that Paul speaks of, which happens not long after the fall of Jerusalem. These are the markers for when the end starts, which is the last half of Daniel's 70th great week of years. We know we have 3.5 years left. And so Jesus points to these things, the fall of Jerusalem and the desolation of abomination, as the when will these things be, the answer to the when question of the disciples. So the parable of the fig tree is answered in two parts. The summer that Jesus speaks of is the time of both suffering and receiving of fruit. So both of those things happen in the summer. It begins with the opening of the leaves in spring, and then the spring flowers, which is sort of the period we're in now, and then comes the summer. It's the latter part of the summer that sees the fruit, but it's also the latter part of the summer that sees the great latter rain that the church is going to need to survive the ordeal. The fruit, of course, speaks of when Israel finally will begin turning to Jesus. It's spiritual fruit. It's the harvest that God is looking for in the nation, the harvest of those who truly accept their Messiah, the true Messiah in Jesus Christ. And it's the summer heat and rain that produce that. So, in other words, within the sign of the fig tree that Jesus speaks of is the sign of Israel's eventual fruitfulness. So, that means there's going to be a fruitfulness of the gospel in Israel. So this time of the churches and Israel's fruitfulness will be the same as the time of their final tribulation. And it's the heat of the summer that it becomes a picture of the spiritual weariness brought on by the great tribulation that both of these groups have to endure at this time. Ironically, it's the great suffering that brings together, that sort of welds these two peoples together and produces the final bride of Christ. Matthew 24:32 to 35, these last few verses are again in two parts. Again, the first part, Matthew 24:32 to 33, says, "Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and it puts forth its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door." And I would argue that we are basically in those days. Now, verse 33 is basically parenthetical to verse 32. It's like an aside. Now, the second part of Matthew 24:32 to 35 says this, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away," and this is the generation of which Jesus is speaking in his answer, which is the final generation. "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So, whereas the world is trying to get rid of the scriptures, unfortunately, they can't do it. The word of Jesus Christ cannot be broken. Everything he says must be fulfilled, and the future that is written in the scriptures cannot be avoided just by trying to extinguish the church and the Jews. We know that from the time of Moses and even from the time of Herod, trying to eradicate the Messianic promise by eradicating all the children at that time, it just doesn't work. God always manages to preserve his remnant. The word of Jesus is therefore sure and nothing can change it. And again, verse 35 is really an aside to verse 34. Now Jesus continues in Matthew 24 verses 36 to 44, and he goes into some sort of elaborations about the conditions at the end. Now this section is also structured. It has three equivalent parts. They all describe the day of resurrection, and they all sort of deal with and sort of tell us to be ready for his coming, not to be caught out unready. So Matthew 24, 36 to 39a, which sort of is the first half of that section. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. Now that last part, even so shall be the coming of the Son of Man, that's the parenthetical part. That's sort of the aside, the comment to the crowd, as it were, after he says those words. Now Matthew 24, 40 to 41, which is the central part of this three-part section, says this, just to illustrate what it's going to be like and how sudden it will be. Then there will be two men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Matthew 24, 42 is parenthetical, therefore stay on the alert. For you do not know which day your Lord is coming. It's obviously going to be very sudden, with the sudden disappearance of people on the earth. Now these two examples point to the universal nature of the event, as a matter of fact, because one is a daytime event, while the other is a nighttime event. Well, actually, I haven't mentioned here that it mentions elsewhere about the two shall be in one bed. I think that's the Luke parallel passage. One shall be taken, one shall be left. So one is a nighttime event, one's a daytime event. But we assume if they're at the same time that this must be a worldwide event. Now, part 3, the last part of this patch, Matthew 24 verse 43 says, "But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming," and I like to think that Christians will have some idea, "he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into," which means that there will still be some inkling to the church of when these things are about to happen, but the world outside will have no idea whatsoever. Again, Matthew 24:44, the last verse in this section, is parenthetical. He says, "For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will." And that suggests that even the church might in some ways be surprised with the actual moment that Jesus comes back for them, which of course feeds strongly into the rapture theory, if you were to believe that theory, but it could also feed into the opposite version as well. Now, these verses, therefore, have formed, the last verses, will form a 7-verse exhortation. So after all these sort of worrying words and these troubling forewarnings, Jesus does exhort us in the last 7 verses of his discourse. He says then, "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is not coming for a long time,' the master will come on a day when he does not expect him, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth," which I think probably speaks of great remorse. Now that place is the earth itself. In meltdown during the day of judgment. Now Jesus comes as a thief in the night to the sinner, but also to the inattentive saint who has fallen asleep in his faith and walk. Sleeping and sinning after the darkness of night, Christ's children are those who walk and work in the openness of the day and have nothing to fear from him. So this same idea of staying spiritually attentive is found in 1 Thessalonians 5:4-9 as well. We read there in that passage, "But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. Nor are we of the night or of darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us be alert and sober. For those who sleep do their sleeping at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ." And with those last words, we conclude today's message. And thank you for coming. Next week we'll continue with Matthew 24 and its correspondence with the book of Revelation. So even though there's been two questions asked today, there'll be a third question that will be answered, and that Jesus does in fact answer in that passage, and that is the question, how will these things take place? So until then, all the best and have a great week.